Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class this afternoon. Thank you for watching, whether you are watching this live here with me today or you are watching the recording. I would just like to say thank you for taking the time to watch and learn. So last week we were in Module 1 and we were kind of laying our foundation and we were doing some Module 1 things as you do. And now this week we're starting to move into that design process. So we're going to start to try to figure out what we need to be doing as web designers when we're approached with a project to design a website. And we start out with research. Just like any good project, every good project starts with research, trying to figure out what exactly needs to be done here. And so, just like every other project, we start here. This is our information gathering, our information collection phase. One of the big ideas is that we want to be able to understand our problem before we try to start to solve it. So when we put it in that sort of perspective, it makes a whole lot of sense, right? So why exactly do we research? Why do we have to put the time into this? We have an understanding of what a good website is. Why would we need to spend the time to research? Well, what we're faced with when we're approaching a new problem without having researched yet, without knowing any specifics on the back end, what we're facing or what we're bringing to the problem are our assumptions. Right? We're bringing our assumptions to the problem to try to figure out how to solve a problem. And we like to think that when it comes to what we think a problem is or how we think something should work, our assumptions and what we need out in the actual world are relatively close together. They might not be overlapping, right? Like this is not a Venn diagram here. We're not seeing any overlap here, but they're pretty close together. We have our assumptions pretty close to what things are like in the actual world. Again, this is what we want to think. We want to think that our assumptions and what's real are close. But in reality, it's more like this, right? We have this huge gap between our assumptions, the things that we believe, the ideas that we bring to a problem before we figure anything out about it, and the problem in the actual world has this huge gap in between it. But now we think this, and in reality is that. So what makes us kind of have that preconceived notion that we saw on that last slide? What are the things that pull together our assumptions with the actual world before we even do any research? Like what makes us think that way? Well, that's just wishful thinking. Right? It's just wishful thinking to assume that the things we believe about a problem before we've done any kind of studying into that problem is in any way reality. So it's the wishful thinking in our own head that kind of bridges that gap to get back to what we saw on the previous screen. But in actuality, what we have here is we have a chasm. We have two things that are far apart. Right? And we can't build success. We can't solve a problem. We can't do the things that need to be done on top of wishful thinking. It's just air. Right? It's just air. And anything we try to build there is going to fall to the ground. I'm reminded of this quote from Nick Remus, who said, "The work that uncovers and articulates the needs of individuals and or groups in order to inform the design of products and services in a structured manner." That's Nick Remus's definition of what research is and what research does. Right? It's the work that uncovers and articulates. Let's break these terms down, right? First one's uncovers. The problem exists. Right? And we understand that a problem exists, or we wouldn't be approaching a design situation, right? In any situation where we're designing something, we're creating something, we're making something where something previously didn't exist, we have a problem that's at the core of that we're trying to solve. And we know that this problem exists, but we're not quite 100% sure of what it is. We have assumptions of a problem. You know, we have what our users believe the problem is. We might have what we believe the problem is. But we don't really know until we perform some advanced archaeology and we start to uncover the real problems. Right? And that's something that we see a lot of times is we have users that are so close to the project and so close to what they believe the problem is that they're blinded by the reality of the situation. And that could happen for designers sometimes too. You know, designers could think that they're so smart that they understand design needs without ever having to perform research. And then we end up putting a lot of effort into solving the wrong problem. And when we do that, we're still back at square one. Like if you solve the wrong problem, I mean, that's just the same as not solving a problem at all. So the first thing that we want to do with research is we want to uncover the real problem. We want to uncover what is the root issue of what we're trying to do here. The second thing is that we want to articulate the needs of individuals and or groups. So in this sort of way, research provides a voice for the voiceless. Right? Like in the research process, we might do some user interviews. We might do some testing of various things, A/B testing, various other types of user interviews and user interactions and user questionnaires. We might get some information from the user. This is information that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Right? In general, the way that a user interacts with a website is either they continue to use a website or they don't. And it's very rare if you were to ever hear of user issues. It's a whole lot easier to just stop and quit than it is to try to get something fixed. So we want to determine the needs of the individuals and or the groups. So essentially the users that are coming to our site, we want to determine their needs through this process of research and give these needs a voice that informs the problem-solving process. It's informing the design of products and services. Now we have this functional definition of design. Right, we have our functional definition of design that you would have read in Module 1. I think I'm sure I intended to mention it last week, but so much was going on that I believe it slipped my mind. But we have our functional definition of design, that design is about solving problems within constraints. Right, so all we're doing is we're solving problems. We pick a problem out, we solve it. But the path to get us from that problem state to that goal state, from that problem to that solution, needs this research to inform that design, to inform that problem-solving structure. You know, that's kind of why we have the book that you're reading, Design is a Job. Right, we're looking at the term structure here. That's kind of why that book is termed Design is a Job, because we like to think of design as something that's kind of mystical. right? Like it's an innate talent. You either have it or you don't. Like, they're artistic, they're creative, they're, you addressed the question of the myth of the creative in one of your discussion assignments last week. But part of what we're doing in this class is we're kind of breaking down that mystique. We're breaking down the idea that you're either creative or you're not, or you're either a designer or an artist or you're not. Because in our case, when we're thinking about design, we're thinking about solving these problems. The solution to these problems comes in the form of structure. There is a process to the way we do things. Right? So as we go through, what essentially we're doing is we're developing that process, right? Like the modules in this course are set up to kind of develop the process as we go through. So we start out with research and understanding the process, and then we move on to wireframing and kind of gaining a foundational knowledge. Then we move on to the development and even further analysis and testing, right? So we're working in this process because it is this process that dictates what we do, not some magic, right? It's kind of one of the things that we were talking about in the last week's stream. User experience seems like magic, but it's not magic. It's work. It's us creating an environment in which something can happen. So we need to start out with the understanding of what we know. That's the first place where we start. What do we know? I'll tell you what we know. Not much. Very little, oftentimes nothing at all. Right? We have a lot of thoughts about our customers and our users. We have a lot of thoughts about people that use the internet and what they like. But these thoughts are oftentimes, they're colored by our bias, or they're colored by the things that we want to do or we want to see happen. But they don't really consider what the user actually wants, right? We have what we call tribal knowledge. By being in a web developer or web designer sphere, we've sort of siloed ourselves into, I guess for lack of a better word, echo chamber. Right? Like we talk about the things that we think are slick on websites and what we think are accomplishments and what we think people need. But it turns out we don't really know a whole lot about what people actually need. We're just bouncing thoughts off a wall in this chamber. Right? And everybody else who's also in that chamber is just going, yeah, that's a great idea. I like that too. It's this tribal knowledge. Information that we have gained just from being a part of an industry for some period of time, any period of time. I really like this little cartoon down here. Really helps to make the point well, right? We have our guy in our first panel. Says our users love sleeping on beds made of nails. Right? Like if that's you, you might think beds of nails are cool. You might have, seen somebody use one at a sideshow and you thought it was neat, thought it was fun, and you think everybody else might share the same opinion. Right? But then we see our user in panel 2 there, and he's dreaming of a nice, plush canopy bed, a place that's, comfortable, other than a bed of nails. Right? In this instance, we've sort of forgotten ourselves in terms of what we actually know. We think we know a lot. We don't really know that much. And so as we're designing, we're approaching a problem essentially with a blank slate, right? Where we get brought a situation by a client, or we come up with this idea, and we should be approaching this idea with this blank slate. with this idea that we have no preconceptions about what's going on. We're going to go in and we're going to do some research and we're going to figure it out. So in doing that, we have this blank slate. That means we have to design something first to help fill up that slate. So the first thing that we really design is a process, is some way of determining our research process. We have to the first thing we design is the research. All right, and my third bullet point here, where we'll talk more about that in just a second. But we say that failure is an expensive way to learn. Right? As a college student, this might be something that some of you have found out. Right? When you're taking college classes, you're paying for those college classes. If you just so happen to not pass one of those college classes, although not any of you specifically because you're all great students, right? But if you just so happen to not pass a college class, well, you still need that credit to graduate. So you have to take that class again, which means you have to pay for it again. And we learn here, and when we learn in a lot of other places in life, that failure is expensive. And you might have heard the saying at some point that when you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So in this research phase, essentially what we're talking about is planning and preparation. And so if we don't do the research, essentially what we're doing is we're saying, hey, I want to fail. And failure is an option, right? But it starts to cost money, right? And it starts to cost time, and time is money. And that's 2 times money, right? That's money times 2. If you're counting the money that you're having to spend in and the time that you're having to spend in. So we want to make sure that we're solving a problem and we're solving the right problem through research. You might think it's a wheel when it's a carousel, right? So you want to find the story of it. This is the point where I also usually, in a seated class, I'll post it alongside of the recording today. This is also the point where I show a clip from the show Mad Men. Right? One of my favorite clips. Where Don Draper, the main character, is presenting a design proposal to Kodak. At this time, the big new Kodak product was the Kodak slide projector, right? Like, this is based back in the 50s. So the slide projector was the big thing, and they had this automated slide projector, and they were calling it the wheel. Right? Because the wheel was this utilitarian invention that lets you get from point A to point B. Right? And since it was an automated slide projector, it had a wheel-looking structure on the top of it that would spin. Right? And so they thought, this is the wheel. It's a technological advancement. It can get you to where you want to go. It's the wheel. How can we sell them? And immediately, Don Draper looks at the situation and he says, hey, that's not what people want. That's not what's going to sell this product. That's not what's going to work with this design. When people look at photos, they're not looking at them to progress. They're not looking at them to go forward. They're looking at them to remember. They're looking at them to go back. So what he told them that they had was not, in fact, the wheel. No, it was more like a time machine, and in so much as it is a time machine, one of the most time machine-like things that we could think of that also moves in a circle, that takes us right back to childhood, to good memories, to fun, happy times, is the carousel. And so this not only solved the problem as to how we can connect this device with the audience, but it also found a story, which I think is pretty important. And when we're looking at the problem and when we're giving voice to our users, that's what we're doing. We're finding the story. What do our users want to be able to do? Why do our users want to be able to do this? In what way can we help them achieve that? How can we do X, Y, or Z? Because it's something that supports our users' goals. And so we find that story. And we can tell that story when we find the problem. When we uncover that problem, perform that advanced archaeology. So the first thing that we do is we craft our research. What methods are we going to use? Are we going to survey people? Right? Are we going to survey our users? Are we going to use other methods? Like, are we going to use direct observation and just kind of sit around an area where a lot of people are using our website or using our software product and just listen to the things that they say and watch or like set up some software that will capture users' motions and, maps and map their paths around a website and just kind of go back and analyze that? What are we going to do? How are we going to determine that problem? What methods are we going to use to research? Now, this isn't a research class, right? Like if you were to get into some university stuff, maybe some secondary level, master's degree stuff, right? Like they focus more heavily on research methods. This is research method light. Right? And because oftentimes what this is going to mean for us where we're at is a survey. We need to contact our users. We need to figure out what they need. Right? And you've even probably participated in some surveys here at the college for various things. We want to gauge interest in new features. We want to gain an understanding of what people who use this product, who use this website, what they need. So we're going to take some time here, especially because it's your lab assignment it's the big lab assignment for this module, and talk about surveys. So when we approach a survey or approaching any kind of research design, what can we do with that information? Well, one, we use it to inform the design of products and services. We've said that already, right? Instead of wishful thinking, filling that gap between our assumptions and the problem in the actual world, our research fills that gap with data. And we can build on this foundation of data, right? That's why everything in this class is so open-ended, and I try to get you to explain things to me and communicate things to me. Is because if you can base something on data and see a positive result, you did the right thing. Right? You are moving the right direction. So this is going to be the foundation of how we design the products that we build and the services that we create. It's going to validate those assumptions or invalidate them, right? It's going to take those two circles and actually move them closer together. Right? It's going to create that bridge or build that path. And it's going to reduce the cost of reaching success because failure is expensive. So in general, your assumptions are worthless, right? We mentioned that already, right? But now we're coming back to our assumptions and talking about validating our assumptions. Right? Remember this when we looked at this earlier on? Right? What was the thing that bridged our assumptions in the actual world? Well, it was wishful thinking. But now imagine some sort of research cannon, right? You know, it's going to shoot out a dart with a rope attached to it, and that's what's going to be pulled across. When we use research, research builds the bridge and actually takes these two separate spheres and puts them into this Venn diagram. It makes them overlap. So it's not just building the bridge, it's actually bringing these two things together. And that's where that solution lies. Right? Because, you have to have some assumptions to a certain degree. But you have to make sure those assumptions are backed up by research. You can't just go blindly into those assumptions. So our assumptions can actually be a good thing, because we have to have a basis to start. Right? We just want to make sure that we're avoiding bias. Because when we end up with bias in research design, it can also end up with bias in our pieces, right? In our products, in our services, in our things we create. Right? There's one of the big things that we consider in the programming and development world called algorithm bias. And one of the big prevalent things that you can see with algorithm bias is in the area of AI, artificial intelligence. We can look at some of the AI models for self-driving cars, for example. And when we look at these AI models for self-driving cars, we see that if they're all built by one particular team, and maybe that team's small, maybe that team's homogenous, right? So if they're all, if you have a small team, especially if it's just, it could even just be one person, right? And when you're developing these algorithms, when you're developing these problem-solving steps, whether intentional or unintentional, you have the potential of building bias into these algorithms. And so you may end up with things like we've seen in the self-driving car sphere, where these AIs that are supposed to recognize people don't recognize everybody, or recognize a certain person, but think it's something else. And that could be an intended consequence, but it could also be an unintended consequence. Right? It could be malicious. Or it could be innocent and just not considered. Right? But we'll get more into that a little bit later. As we're developing our surveys, one of the big questions that we want to ask is we need to kind of figure out what information we're trying to get. So we want to check out these surveys. We want to look and see where patterns are emerging. right? Because if you have multiple people saying the same thing on a survey, you might want to pay more attention to that thing. You might learn some things that you'd have never known before, or you'd have never assumed. That's these unknown insights here. Right? Just like if you think it's a swan, it could be a fish, or vice versa. Right? We pull out these unknown insights that we couldn't see before. As we're designing our research, we want to set objectives. We want to have goals. We want to create hypotheses as to how we get to these goals, and then we want to reach conclusions through well-informed processes. This allows us to invent possible futures. And this takes and makes the whole idea of survey development sound enormous, right? And in a way it is, right? Because really what we're talking about here is we're talking about building a survey. I mean, at the core of what we're talking about here in developing research for something that's at our scope, we're talking about building a survey. And we haven't even started like writing questions yet, right? We've just came up with some goals that we want to be able to use to test some hypotheses, test some preconceived notions, and use this survey to help us reach the conclusions, whether our objective is correct or our objective is incorrect. So we have different types of research that we could be doing. And we can bake all of these into surveys, right? We have qualitative versus quantitative. We have generative versus evaluative. And we have behavioral versus attitudinal. And so these are essentially dimensions by which we can categorize research methods. And they're not black and white, right? When we're asking questions on a survey, they could be shades of gray. They could be a little bit qualitative and a little bit quantitative, or we can have qualitative and quantitative questions on the same survey. You know, we want to get both sides of our dimension in a single method oftentimes. Right, so we'll say like qualitative versus quantitative. Or you'll read in things qualitative versus quantitative. But we should consider them more like a pair. Like our screen here says, it's qualitative and quantitative. Generative and evaluative. Because these things work together to help us get to those problems. So, qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative methods are typically anything you can count, anything that you can put a definite unit on is quantitative. You can get a quantity of it, right? Time on page, percentage of users engaging with an item, so clicks, right? Page views. You can count clicks, you can count page views. You can count how long it takes from somebody to start a form until they get to the end of the form. These are all things that you can count. So you can count the time that it takes for them to get from the start to the end. And you can get a number there. But what you don't know from that is how that length of time, for example, makes them feel. What are their emotions or their attitudes or their feelings toward having to take that long to fill out a form, or toward having to do that many clicks to complete a process, or whatever, right? And that's where we get into these qualitative methods. These are our intangibles. These are the things that we can't count. We can't measure them directly. So we have to measure them indirectly. So when you're building a survey, you want questions that represent both of these. You want questions that are closed-ended, are multiple choice, that give our users some limited choices and, give us data points on the back end that we can count, right, for these quantitative metrics. But we also want qualitative metrics. We want open-ended questions where we can ask our users their feelings about certain things and try to figure out these intangibles that we couldn't find out through any other method. So as we are building these questions, right, and the things that we have here aren't necessarily, under our quantitative methods, what we would ask on a survey. Right, we might do that. Like we might ask them how many clicks it took them to get from the home page to the download page, for example. But we can ask questions that are multiple choice questions that give our users a finite set of answers to where we can have quantifiable data on the back end that can help us make decisions without allowing our users to open things up too far. Right? Because if we have everything open-ended, we lose out on that quantitative, we lose out on the count, we lose out on specifics. Things get too broad if you let your user base their answer for everything on open-ended questions. You can have 20 different users and 20 different answers. So we need some kind of quantitative format, some kind of more focused multiple choice thing where we can get data points. What do you like most? A, B, C, or D? And then they select one. But that's also meaningless without the qualitative to sort of back that up. Why do they like it? Right? Why did they like this certain thing? What's the reasoning? So we need both of these types of questions on our survey. The next thing we have is generative versus evaluative. And generative research is focused on efforts targeted at a deeper understanding of our user needs and desires. So this is essentially what we see here is concept development through participatory design activities. So it's through generative research that we actually get our user involved in the design process. And we might ask them questions like, can you draw a layout that you would prefer for this? Or where would you like the such and such button to be on the screen? Or do you like A better or B better? We can look at A/B testing through generative research and actually get the user involved in direct design decisions. Last fall, we were able to have this class seated, and we did an exercise where we did a generative design activity, and it's actually what led to the new CCC homepage, in part. Right? At first, we did some informal surveying of the people in the room, and then we did this a little bit later on in the course. So we already knew how to do wireframing and mock-ups and things like that. So I said, okay, well, now that we've gotten this general surveying out, build me a wireframe of how you'd like it to work, or build me a mock-up of what you think it should look like. What should the links say? Where should they go? Right? Because really, it's perfect. Because, they students are the clients for the Cleveland Community College homepage. Right? And I believe it was a marked improvement to go from where we were previously, before that time, to where we are now. Evaluative research, on the other hand, is used for assessing a specific problem to ensure usability and ground it in wants, needs, and desires of real people. We'll talk about heuristic evaluation. Right? It's this heuristic evaluation that is this evaluative thing. Right? Essentially what we're saying is, oh, here's a goal for you. Say you want to register for a class, or you want to apply to the college. Do it and tell me how it works out for you. Tell me about the different things that you found along the way that worked well or didn't work quite as well. What would you rather see? Right? What are the wants, the needs, and the desires that you want to be able to do to get to that end goal quicker? And so depending on where you are in your research process, you might want to focus more on generative research, especially if you're in early stages of ideation, or more evaluative research. Is this right, what we're building? Are we on the right track? Can people meet their goals by following this design? Our last dimension is attitudinal versus behavioral. Attitudinal involves opinions. Behavioral involves actions. Right? So we can get opinions from people about how our website works. But it's also beneficial to sit down and watch them. Or install some of that hot mapping software that'll actually track their mouse and maybe their eye movements. If you do the whole camera thing like you can do with certain softwares. And just to see how they actually interact with the site. Where they're going, what they're doing, how they're getting to a particular resource. Which resources are they using? Right, so for certain situations, it might be more important to know just what your users think. And for other situations, it might be more important to know exactly what your users do. So let's take all of this and bring it back to surveying. We use surveying a lot, and it's a great place to start here at our level because it's inexpensive, it's cheap, and we can get insight quickly. Right? We know it's cheap. We can go and build a Microsoft form or a Google form, and we can send it out to people, and we can collect data through that same form, and it'll analyze that data for us nowadays, which is great, right? And you've taken a survey before, so I don't know that I really need to get in depth about what exactly a survey is. But when we're talking about crafting a survey, we're talking about something that's really a balancing act, kind of like what we mentioned earlier. If we have too many closed-ended questions, we don't get any of that qualitative data. Right? We don't get any of that emotional, intangible understanding of what we're building. But if we have too many open-ended questions, we don't have any firm data points on which we can use to make decisions. Plus, there's the fact of, open-ended questions might just cause your users to just get tired of it. Right? If I have to type a paragraph for every single question that you're asking me, it's going to get old pretty quick, right? So how can we get around that? If we don't have the opportunity to talk to our subjects, we want to mix the questions together, right? One way that we approach the problem is we can give a completely closed-ended survey, and then after they respond to the survey, we sit down with them and we talk to them about it. So the survey itself is more formal, and it's all closed-ended, and it's based on, and it builds on those data point structures. And then we have a more informal conversation to determine the qualitative stuff. But that's not always possible, right? Especially nowadays. Everybody wants to be able to do everything online. And we all are kind of a little low on time. So if we mix questions that are closed-ended questions with open-ended questions, maybe have a few closed-ended questions and then an open-ended question that asks them to explain, can kind of get around this idea of mixing our qualitative and quantitative data dimensions for this research. And so if possible, right, like we want to be able to talk to our users. Maybe we want to reach out to them, ask them more questions, get together a focus group type of environment just to see if something is a good idea or not. Now, the problem with surveys, and we've already mentioned the idea of biases, and just like we can bake biases into our algorithms, we can bake biases into our surveys. So then the potential for bias isn't just in the products that we create, but it could also be in the solutions that we use to try to figure out what we need. Because we write the surveys, right? And so when we're writing the surveys, we're coming to those surveys with those preconceived notions, those assumptions that are worthless, right? We said they're worthless earlier. Our assumptions are worthless, but that's what we bring to our survey. So if we're only focusing on our own assumptions and not trying to get other ideas from other places, our survey in turn is going to be worthless. And it won't reveal the actual problem. Also, in terms of surveying for website builds, right? One of the things that we'll talk about, especially later on, is that there are no edge cases, right? We build websites for everybody. So if we build some websites for everybody, our websites are for the entire world. So then if we survey 10 of our friends, that's not really representational of who our potential client base would be. Right? So we want to try to make sure that we are getting a diverse group of people to answer our questions and try to get as many of them as possible to answer our questions. And answering multiple choice questions and open-ended questions. And then we go back afterwards and we look at that quantitative data and we look and we analyze it. And we can see the graphs that things like Google Forms and such build for us. And we can read the follow-up qualitative data. And we can see the feelings and emotions that support that quantitative data. And we can take all of that and we can put it into something that we can use to validate a plan and build that problem-solving solution. Right? This is our survey. Survey says, ooh. Now, are there better collection methods? I'm not asking you to do any of these, right? Because I think they're kind of outside the scope. But these are other ways that we can collect data: focus grouping, usability testing, A/B testing, and what we call the service safari, which is kind of interesting. So with a focus group, we're just getting people together to talk. Our focus groups have been around for a long time, right? But one of the issues with focus grouping is that since it is a group of people all in one room talking about things at once, it places an emphasis on groupthink. And so when it places that emphasis on groupthink, it might not identify all the needs of the individuals. right? There could be demographics or diverse individuals that are a part of your user base that are left out in a focus grouping type of environment because everybody just kind of wants to go along with the group. Usability testing basically uses a mock-up or prototype or drawing, or you can even use a live code site, and you give your users tasks and invite them to complete those tasks while you watch. This is also heuristic evaluation as an example of this as well. And so this is a very powerful method that you can directly determine or use to directly determine necessary changes. And this is something that you can do in coordination with A/B testing, right? So when we're talking about usability testing here, we're just giving someone a sample, telling them, asking them to work through it, seeing what they are able to use, what they're able to find, what they like, what they don't like. And if we take a B and put it with that A, then we can use that usability testing with some A/B testing. And so with A/B testing, what this does is it calls for us to show a user 2 or more options. Typically, we limit it at 2 options just to keep responses closed-ended, right? We don't want to give too many options, because if we open it up too much, it gives that potential to go off track and take the problem-solving process off the rails. One of the big issues about having too many options is this idea of scope creep. We start getting into those nice-to-haves instead of those neededs to solve the problem. And if we don't solve the problem first, then we could spend a bunch of time out in the weeds with these nice-to-haves and not actually get anything done, right? So the big idea is to focus on the problem that you're solving first. And then you can bring back in those nice-to-haves as you refactor and add these features as you go along. But the first thing that your site should do is solve that primary problem. So with A/B testing, we're giving our users 2 options, asking them to give you feedback in a usability testing session for both of the options. Give them the pros, give them the cons, and you can even do this in relation to one another. Right? And so what this does is it opens the conversation and provides more honest feedback, right? Like if you give somebody options, they don't feel obligated to say they like the thing, right? Like some people, they want to be nice. So if you present them with something and you say, what do you think of this? They'll say, yeah, I like it. But if you start talking to somebody about which one they prefer, instead of, do you like this, which one of these 2 options do you prefer? Then you can get more honest opinions out of them because they're not as afraid to hurt your feelings, because at least you're liking something, right? So you can use actually A/B testing quantitatively by providing users with interface variations in the wild, which is kind of incredible. Like you hear Twitter rolled out a new interface thing, right? But they might roll it out to a certain group of users, right? They might just select 100,000 group users at random and give them this new interface option. And that's a test. And so you can see how that test group performs quantitatively with this new interface versus how the other people are performing with the old interface, or how they performed previously with the old interface. The service safari, right? A service safari involves going out into the wild and experiencing a service firsthand, right? Like this is undercover boss type stuff is what we're talking about here. Right, like let's say you built a site where you can buy airline tickets. How do you perform a service safari on a site where you can buy airline tickets? Well, it's time for a vacation. Right, let's buy an airline ticket on this site. What are the pain points? Experience that service firsthand. If you work in a large organization, or you're in an area where people are using your product, like if you designed a kiosk software or what have you, you can put a bunch of kiosks in a location and just sit back and watch. Or if you work at a large company, you can check out how many help desk tickets get put in for a certain service. Or you can just listen to the ground, put your ear to the ground just to see what the general consensus is about this new product that's been introduced into the work atmosphere. So as you have these experiences, you make note of the interactions. You understand what's going on. You put yourself in the shoes of the user, which makes this incredibly valuable and incredibly meaningful to do, right? Because it's direct experience. Let me just check my slide deck here just to see. What I'd like for us to say. Let's check this out here, and then I'll leave you. Where do we begin? We begin by looking for the unmet needs. And our unmet needs are where those right problems to solve are. And when we say needs, right, we're contrasting needs with wants here. What are the needs? What needs are going unmet? There's where we start to solve problems. So let's just go through a few announcements here at the end, and I will leave you with my final thought for the week that you can kind of keep in the back of your brain and think about from time to time. I'm in the process of grading your assignments from Module 1. I've already graded some of them, and we'll be finishing those over the next couple of days. If you have any questions, please get in touch with me. I haven't really heard from many people yet in terms of questions. I hope you're finding all of the material okay. Like we went through the course navigation and stuff back in the beginning here module. So hopefully you're able to get through everything okay. If you're having issues with that, let me know. And the stuff from Module 2 is due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. So please make sure you have that completed by that time. I'll send you a reminder, toward the end of the week, as I usually do. But here is our final thought, and it's a quote. You can optimize everything and still fail, because you have to optimize for the right things. That's where reflection and qualitative approaches come in. By asking why, we can see the opportunity for something better beyond the bounds of the current best. Even math has its limits. And that was said by Erica Hall, who wrote the book Just Enough Research, which is a valuable book that I would also suggest you pick up and read if you're able. But that's all that I have for you for this week. We have hit our hour mark, so I'm glad that that's all that I have for you for this week. Take this quote, think about it over the week. If you have any questions, please let me know. We'll hang out on the chat for just a couple minutes in case anybody's here that has questions. If you're watching this later and you have questions, again, let me know. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.